All right. Thank you, Pat. So today it's my privilege to introduce Catherine Banet. She's an associate professor at the Scandinavian Institute of Maritime Law and head of the Department of Energy and Resources Law at the University of Oslo in Norway. Her research focuses on renewable energy, support schemes and alternative financing models, energy market design, energy infrastructures regulation, climate change mitigation measures, including carbon capture and storage, and offshore wind and hydrogen regulation. Her background is from private law school in Norway and France, the European Commission with DG Environment, a US diplomatic mission, and academia. She is a member of the advisory academic group to the International Bar Association, section for Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources and Infrastructure Law. She's an academic fellow at the Center on Regulation in Europe, and she's the chair of the board of the Norwegian Energy Law Association. Catherine, it is our pleasure to welcome you today with your deep energy law experience and knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us from Oslo. It's a little bit later in the day there, and we sure appreciate your stepping forward. Welcome today.
Well, Felicia and Patricia, thank you very much for your kind introductory words and for the invitation. It's a real honor to address the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum today. So the presentation will focus on the issue, the topic of resilience. And as you can see from this presentation, I would like to address the specific approach of planning and planning for resilience and what does it mean in terms of legal obligations and processes. The background for the presentation is a book that we just published. Felicia mentioned my participation to the advisory and my academic group to the International Bar Association. And it is in that framework that we have developed this book project. And I had the honor of being the lead editor for that book. So therefore, we had a few thoughts about what is resilience in the legal context. And what I will present is the content of my chapter, which is related to planning. I would like to address the following points in this presentation, starting by a reflection on the concept of resilience, then reflecting as well of what is the role of planning and why do we see a resurgence of planning as a legal tool, looking at some specific planning processes and assessing them in the lens of resilience as a criterion. And at the end, I would like as well to reflect whether we have sufficient integration or coordination tools between the different planning processes, or whether we need to emphasize that. Starting by defining resilience, we first need to make the observation at the very start that we are in a very special situation today. And the book project started as well with the observation of the situation of extreme weather events, including floods, wildfires, hurricane, and other natural disasters that have come both more frequent and more severe over the years. And at the same time, the world is facing, has been facing during the past few years, a major threat to public health in the form of COVID-19 pandemic. So we have accumulation of different threats, and there are different sources of disruption. But in the context of that book, we focused on nature-based disruption. During the past few weeks, we unfortunately witnessed other forms of disruption, such as wars, and before that, we have terrorist attacks or digital attacks and other forms of industrial accident as well. But in the context of this project, and because of the specificities of nature-based disruptions, we decided to focus on that. Looking at other sources of disruption may have also led to other type of legal instruments related to the matter we address those. Another important observation was that the growing world population and increasing demand for resources alongside rising living standards have resulted in the unprecedented use of natural resources, increasing energy demands and construction of new infrastructure. So that adds to the pressure on the ecosystems. And that is again and again stressed by the reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that also illustrate that we are nearing the planetary boundaries in many respects. So that is our starting point for looking at resilience. But when we did that, we refused to take, let's say, a pessimistic approach to it. Also, the scale of the impacts, the frequency and cumulative effects of those disruptive events may call for it. And sometimes it has been termed collapsology or end of growth. But we decided to take, as said, a more a positive approach to it and to look at the solutions in advancing in the way we are developing and moving towards resilience. So the project really much focused on how the law and regulation in different legal orders have responded to the different threats, different forms of disruption, and can't be reformed or reimaginated to make energy and natural resources system more resilient in the face of disruptive natural events. We did not address the resilience of the law, but how law can foster resilience of those systems. So that was an important scoping element. So next comes to the question of the definition of resilience. And the concept of resilience, you may have heard about it before, and it has indeed gained increasing recognition in a broad range of disciplines since the years 2000. However, in my field of research, which is law, the concept of resilience lacks still recognition, but I will come back to that. We see that is coming in different ways and mostly in an inconsistent way. There are very few laws that refer to resilience as an objective of legislative intervention, but by contrast, many laws will refer to concepts like reliability, adequacy of supply, or security of supply, for example, in the energy field. So we have neighboring concepts and a very few direct references to resilience. And when it is not, it is done, it's mostly in the form of a general objective. If we go back to the basics, and that will be Latin, the noun resilience comes from the Latin verb resilere, meaning to recall or to rebound, and it was used in the 1600s as meaning springing back. Later in the 18,000, 19,000, it took a more technical understanding, and it was associated to the qualities of materials and equipment to resist shocks. So a much more technical approach to it. In social science, where resilience is a well-established concept, it has been defined as a system's capacity to absorb disturbance and still remain within the same state, shape, or domain. Authors like C.S. Holling have further theoretized the concept in the context of ecological sciences. And they established that resilience is the ability of a natural system to resist and undergo changes without losing its core structure and function. If we compare to the energy field, resilience, notably actually in US context, has been defined as the ability to withstand and reduce the magnitude and or duration of disruptive events, which includes the capability to anticipate, absorb, adapt to, and or rapidly recover from such an event. So we have here a very interesting evolution of the concept, but as well of its integration into the different fields. What should be noted is that resilience connotes more than merely resistance to a shock. it shows the ability of a system to deal with the change and to continue to develop, where develop does not necessarily mean growth, but you have a development of that system in order to resist and to adapt to the shock. Sometimes it could flip to another state, another nature, but that's when the resilience movement is moving a step forward. But the process of resilience is therefore not linear, but more like a spiral, I illustrated as well on the presentation, including a transformative phase. So it can be preventive before a disaster occurs, but could also follow a disaster, rebounding from it to use the window of opportunity created by that disaster to introduce resilience. And that's very well captured by the term build back better. As summarized by a center working on resilience, the Stockholm's Resilience Center, resilience is the capacity of a system, be it an individual, a forest, a city, or an economy, to deal with change and continue to develop. It is about how humans and nature can use shocks and disturbances, like, for example, a financial crisis or a pandemic or climate change, to spur renewal and innovative thinking. So this development dimension of resilience is not a synonym, as I said, of growth, although it could be associated with the growth process for the community or the territory encompassed. And to align with sustainability goals, this development dimension of resilience should be associated as well with the management of ecosystems. There are some of their interlinkages captured by the notion of socio-ecological resilience. So that's an important starting point for understanding as well the concept of resilience. Now, when we look at the legal context for resilience, it has raised a series of challenges, because it was primarily a concept from social sciences that needed to be transposed into a legal context, and primarily legislative context, where it is increasingly referred to as an objective. So we see that resilience is progressively appearing as a new paradigm into the legislation, but often it is used as a convenient concept. We want to have more resilient infrastructures. We want to have a more resilience to climate change. But this is not defined first in the legislation for most of the time, and it is not understood in a consistent manner. So there is a clear need for better and more consistent recognition of the concept in the legislation. That's the main argument. And the proposal for having, and the first step is defining it, of course, and the proposal that we have made of a definition of resilience in legal context is the following: the ability of our social ecological ecosystems to resist and adapt to disruptions and to pursue sustainable development and equity in an inclusive and nature-based manner. We try to come forward as well with some concrete proposals in the book. As said, I will focus this presentation on my own chapter that focuses on planning. And why discussing planning? What is that relevant and interesting? Well, the need to integrate and monitor different requirements related to energy and climate change has resulted in the adoption of new coordination tools. And among them, planning is experiencing a revival, and particularly the use of plans as distinctive legal instruments in monitoring the energy and ecological transition. So we see that at different level, international level, we have notably under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, and they also decline at the more local level, would it be national or very local level, energy and climate plans. So that will be a concrete example of the need we see to have more planning and an example of adoption of new plans. So, and those serve as coordination and integration tools by merging the different planning processes into one plan. Two additional considerations should be added here. First, the energy and climate plans come in addition to other existing plans within spatial and natural resources management, raising the question already of interaction and possibly coordination with those planning processes too. Second, the increasing occurrence and impacts of disruptive nature-based events affecting energy and ecosystem call for a more transversal application of the objective of resilience across planning processes. So the objective pursued here by the analysis is really to assess the extent to which resilience is already defined as a criteria in relevant planning processes and how a more coordinated, integrated approach to planning law could be developed to ensure that it is applied in a more consistent manner. And I encourage you to think about the different plans you will find at the local level and as well at the national plans related to climate and energy that would be a good references for you in that context. So the revival of planning takes different forms. And when we talk about plans, planning is not an end in itself. It is mostly a purposeful action. It is both a means that we want to plan. We want to be able to implement that plan as a document, but as well, it is a process to promote notably development. And then there will be interaction with many actors and different fields as well of competence along that process. According to an American author, James Galbraith, planning, when properly conceived, deals with the use of today's resources to meet tomorrow's need. And this stresses very much a development perspective, which is common to both planning and resilience thinking. You can think about very basic definition of planning as the action of organizing things according to plans. But plans can also take different forms. You have plans that are just a document or a map, while others will take a more strategic approach to the planning process. What is interesting for the lawyers is the legal nature of those processes, the planning requirements, but as well the legal nature of the resulting document. And that has an important consequence for the way consistent, the consistent manner or not resilience is defined in those different documents. I would like to take 4 examples of relevant planning processes for the question I raised here. Those 4 plans are related to energy, to climate, spatial planning, and natural resources planning. So we spend a few minutes defining those different planning processes. Energy planning occurs both at the energy system and the energy infrastructure level. When we talk about energy planning, energy system planning, it refers to the process of designing and implementing policies regarding the development of the energy system in all its different components: generation, storage, conversion, transport, consumption. And it can't be undertaken at the local, national, regional level. Energy planning can be short, mid, long-term. Usually long-term is 30, 50 years, and mid-term is 10 years. And it can apply to different time frames as well, and spaces that enables to adjust to different targets and circumstances. Energy planning processes are heavily influenced by energy modeling. So energy modeling will involve different disciplines such as computer engineering, physics, economics, geography, but they are also those processes often the basis for energy planning policies and decisions, and that raises the need to clarify the processes, objective, responsibilities, and scope through the legislation. Historically, the countries have developed their own energy planning framework differently in terms both of the legally binding nature of the plans and the content. So from very few objectives to define and detailed programs. The examples of comprehensive legal frameworks on energy planning are, however, rare, in particular at the national energy system. An additional element is liberalization or deregulation of the energy markets and that before the liberalization, energy planning was conducted internally within companies. And in addition, it was often combining the different energy carriers. So you had electricity, gas, and heat in the portfolio. Now everything should be separated and bundled, and that creates challenges also for energy planning. So we need to think differently in terms of optimization of the energy planning in a liberalized environment. There are very few requirements under the legislation that applies to energy system planning. That applies to both European legislation, but other types of legislation. So when we find requirements related to planning is mostly at the level of the infrastructure. So transmission, distribution, the grid for electricity, gas, or heating. And energy infrastructure planning relates there to the planning of transport network development. Very much detailed and with clear processes for planning, allocation, and responsibilities. More shortly, when we look at the other relevant processes, the next one is climate governance. And planning has more recently entered the climate governance domain. With an increasingly more important role in climate legislation at the international, national, and local level. So it's kind of new trend within that regulatory space. And climate planning pursues mainly two purposes. The first one is the implementation of climate objectives based on a list of targets, measures, and trajectories. And that will contribute through the planning process to increase transparency, accountability, but as well to ensure investment confidence. We find that in the Paris Agreement with the nationally defined contributions, and as well at the European level with the national energy and climate plans, or even at the local level with local climate plans. The second purpose behind climate planning relates to adaptation, and adaptation takes quite an important place in climate planning. The third process relates to spatial planning. That is an instrument of long-term space governance, and it relies on a series of management and legal tools. They are mostly of strategic or regulatory nature, where we will find, for example, the basis in those regulatory planning tools for permitting or special delineation, zoning, for the different uses and activities. So here we will already see that the interaction between the different interests, environmental protection, industrial areas, urban functions, prevention of natural disasters will be assessed in that planning processes. So here we see an integration level already. And we can also find sub-areas covering specific geographic areas in spatial planning at the level of the city, maritime or coastal zone, all the activities, land use, agriculture, landscape, housing, transport. The fourth relevant planning process that I have identified is natural resources planning. And that is a resource management instrument for planning the work with and use of notably renewable and non-renewable natural resources, such as forests, soils, minerals, water, wildlife. And here again, the balance between the utilization of resources and the protection of natural ecosystem is a central concern. And we can find general natural resources plans, but as well more specific plans focused on some specific geographic ecosystem, rivers, wetlands, or specific resources like forests, wildlife, waste, water. So on that basis, I have now defined the 4 processes that I wanted to assess and whether the criterion of resilience is taken into account in those processes. Because what we see is indeed that resilience is progressively more integrated in the planning processes and as a direct consequences as well of the application of socio-ecological thinking to the legal processes. And this is due to the fact that humans and nature should be considered as one social ecological system. So we have a process towards more integration of resilience consideration early in the planning process. At least it should be a goal, but it is not necessarily done in a consistent manner again. But different authors have been trying to develop methodologies, and this has been termed resilience planning. And you can see an example of that, notably in the picture on the presentation that is based on the works, notably of Resilience Alliance in Australia, but as well it was further developed by other authors, and they call that the clouds heuristic. And this is methodology for integrating resilience in planning processes. And that will lead to a new methodological approach for integrating resilience into the planning processes. We find some examples, early examples as well, of practitioners that have applied this approach, notably in Australia since the early 2000s, where they use resilience planning as a general objective or steering criterion among all stages of planning processes. But as well, it has quickly developed in Asian Pacific countries as a response to extreme natural disasters. They have suffered early from those disasters and needed to develop tools for that. So those are concrete examples of those theories. And therefore argue that by defining resilience as a criteria in the legislation, we will make sure to develop more integrated planning systems and to as well make sure that the criterion of resilience is correctly taken into account. Something as well that I would like to stress is that we indeed see a resurgence of planning as a legal tool, even if we, in the jurisdiction we are living in, are operating in liberalized environments. And the current resurgence of planning instruments, in particular the different plans I talked about, really witness a general tendency in favor of more interventionist approach in regulation of energy and ecological transition. And why so? Because primarily we need to move very quickly to reach targets. We have more and more ambitious targets for reduction of emissions, for generation of renewable energy sources, for energy transition, etc. But we need to ensure that those objectives will be reached on a very short term. So that means that we need steering the fundamental transformations of the energy system and societies and how this should be done. So it's a deep curve, and we need therefore steering mechanisms and plans as, for example, trajectories are also an important tool. In a historical perspective, it represents a revival of the planning initiatives developed under World War I and later in the 1930s in Europe and the United States, where the objective was to compensate market deficiencies and contribute to the war effort by a better management of resources. Right after World War II, this was combined with a reconstruction and modernization effort completed in the 1960s through the achievement of more social, economic development, environmental protection objectives. So that corresponds very much to the long-term growth dimension in today's resilience discourses. And what is very interesting too, and consistent in a way, is that the current revival of planning in EU legislation is taking place within the framework of the so-called EU Green Deal that you may have heard about, with clear semantic references to the New Deal of Roosevelt. So here we have clear references. There is no war situation today as it could have been under the war effort before, but we are in a situation of climate and environmental emergency situation that may as well call for action. And indeed, we are in the decade to act. And what happened after the COVID-19 pandemic and the different plans for recovery was also another illustration of the resurgence of planning for rapid action. So we found examples at the EU level or at the US level of such a resurgence, because we are at the Santa Fe Business Affairs Forum today. I would like to take a US example, and I found a similar call for strengthened planning obligations on the part of both public authorities and utilities in the US, where the Environmental Defense Fund proposed that state public utilities commissions should require gas utilities to perform holistic and transparent long-term planning that includes a consideration of consistency with state climate goals together with possible remediation actions. So that's something that has been proposed. It was last year, and that would as well ensure more planning with concrete actions. And in California in 2020 Commission rulemaking addressed the need similarly to perform long-term gas system planning together with the revision of the standards for gas public utilities in the view of greenhouse gases emissions reduction legislation. So there should be consistency, references, and a list of concrete long-term planning action should be developed. So strengthening planning requirements in sectors that are otherwise largely subject to market-based mechanisms like energy sector, of course, shows a need for a new balance. We're not going to go back to centralized, integrated processes along the value chain, but we need to combine the two approaches. If we now look at the criterion of resilience that, as you understood, should be better integrated early in the planning processes, is applied in the different plans that I have identified. We first need to look at the legislation on strategic environmental assessment, SEA, and then looking at some examples of the relevant plans. In most jurisdictions, the elaboration of plans will be subject to SEA requirements, and SEA is a process aimed at ensuring that the likely significant environmental effects of plans and programs, PPs, are identified, assessed through a process that includes public participation, but as well that will lead to a list of mitigation measures. And SEA is recognized concept also already for a long time, including in the US, and it was based on the development of the US National Environmental Policy Act. So this is something that is common to many jurisdictions. At the international level, we have the 2003 UNESCO Protocol on Strategic Environmental Assessment to the ESPO Convention. That is the international instrument that is the most relevant. When we look at the content of that instrument that focuses on different plans covered by it, but as well the types of impact and the types of environments that must be assessed and sectors, activities, it is absolutely relevant to resilience because it goes across. However, there is no reference to resilience as such in that legal framework, and therefore a major advancement would be to integrate resilience and social ecological resilience in the SEA framework. Because as it is today, it is quite paradoxal, because we have an increasing use of planning requirements to steer the energy and ecological transition, a general call for applying social ecological resilience to planning, but the SEA rules do not yet integrate resilience consideration in a sufficiently explicit manner. So that's one of the conclusion. And by integrating resilience at that level, that will be also more easy to enforce those plans. When we look at the four plan processes that I defined for energy, climate, spatial management, and natural resources plan, we see that resilience as a criterion is taken into account, but in different manners. For example, for the energy plans, there are references mostly to energy security and security of supply. So reliability and operational flexibility are key concepts in energy plans, in particular in energy infrastructure plans. We also find references to a climate resilience in some of those planning kind of climate stress criteria for the infrastructures. But still, we find few common framework for integrating resilience as a broader concept. And ensuring resilience is often seen and calculated in terms of cost for utilities, notably the price for replacing or repairing a power line after a storm. That represents a sort of barriers for really assessing the scope, the breadth of resilience. A change of approach and method is therefore required, and researchers at the US National Regulatory Energy Laboratory have developed a methodology for quantifying the benefits of resilience to energy systems. So there are some proposals on the table here. When it comes to climate plans, the concept of climate resilience has gained as well recognition, but it is primarily in relation to adaptation. So we have requirements related to adaptation planning. When it comes to spatial management, we also find references to resilience, and it has also been integrated into spatial management plans quite early. And the references are first and foremost, the ones to climate adaptation again, and to disaster risk reduction, DRR. We also have some guidelines there. For natural resources plan, the relationship between resilience and natural resources planning goes in two directions. And in one direction, you see the need to ensure the resilience of natural ecosystem to extreme nature-based events. And at the same time, in reverse direction, the awareness of the potential the natural ecosystem have in fostering resilience, so nature-based solutions. So here we have a very interesting bidirectional relationship that must be further explored. But the general conclusion when we look at the application of the resilience criteria in those different processes is that we have different understanding of it, and it is not necessarily consistent. And that also points into the direction of the lack of coordination, if not integration methods between the different planning processes. And that leads me to my final point, that is the need for ensuring a more consistent application of the resilient criteria in those processes, and that can be done in a vertical manner or a horizontal manner, ensuring integration and coordination. Because most of those different plans will follow a certain hierarchy, where you will have possibly the legislation on the top of that, defining the different national plans, state plans, local plans. and with some specific requirements. And there will be a hierarchy, and the lower level of plans will need to be consistent with the upper level. Otherwise, they could be illegal. So therefore, it is important to define clearly resilience and with a precise definition at the top of that hierarchy, so it will be applied down the hierarchy in a consistent manner. The legal status of those different plans will therefore also be instrumental in ensuring consistency in the application of it. And the other manner to ensure a better consistency in the definition of resilience and the different means is to look at horizontal interactions. And the plans, increasingly, the different ones I mentioned, refer to each other. And the legislation regulating the plan processes often describe kind of duty to take into account, should be consistent with, should be fully in line with the other relevant plans. But this is difficult to monitor. Enforcement of such obligation is often weak, except when the planning authorities are obliged to describe the manner they will ensure that interaction, the way they take into account the different plans. A second and more formal approach will be to merge or to integrate the different processes. That's something that we see as well coming, notably in the European legislation. Also, it's limited to energy and climate, but we have the attempt on having more integrated planning processes. If we look now at the element of coordination, so not necessarily integration of the processes, but coordination between the different entities responsible for planning, because we have indeed many different planning authorities for different sectors, and their action may not be coordinated in a very well manner, and that will hinder a consistent and cost-effective approach to resilience as well. We can identify, however, some best practice in the area, and I will mention a few. We have first some obligations for those different separate planning of entities to have a coordination duty. So sometimes they will have a duty to consult the other ones when they are preparing their plans. And it could be also at sectoral level, but as well at the geographical level when activities will go beyond the border. Another alternative will be to establish formal committees, for example, state or ministerial committees, administrative procedures, or even persons in charge of the cross-sectoral coordination. That already happens at the city level, and this has resulted in the creation of the position of so-called a Chief Resilience Officer, CRO, who serves as the connecting point between different decision-making agencies and departments to facilitate the integration of different planning processes. So we have some examples of that, mostly again at the city level. So in conclusion, I would like again to stress the move that we see today towards the integration of socio-ecological resilience into different fields, including in the legislative field. It is mostly referred to as an objective, a general concept, but in order to be operationalized, it needs to be defined more in detail. And it also is instrumental for getting concrete to be integrated in the planning process across the different sectors and the different ecosystem environments in order to ensure energy and ecological resilience to that. The easiest way is to define resilience in the upper level of the planning documentation hierarchy, starting with strategic environmental assessment, sectoral legislation, but this can be also supplemented by a more horizontal approach because it takes time to reform the legislation and to be operational on the short term. Coordination of planning authorities and planning processes could also be done that way. I spoke quite a lot, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion now.